the P-A-T-R-I-S word, and I can't even pronounce it because if it's patris, then I'm giving away its genitive. If I say patris, then I'm giving away its accusative. So whatever that word is, depending on its case form, depends, it tells you how many elements are in the line. So we pick it up in that last full paragraph on page 13. If the genitive reading is correct, there are 3 elements, consisting of husband, home of her father, and children. Does everybody agree to that? Do we see that?
No.
Yes.
Yeah. Bottom of 13.
Yeah.
Has already been discussed. Arguments can.
No, previous paragraph.
Okay.
But I mean, do you see it in the Latin text?
Yeah.
Oh. Gotta get that out.
Yeah.
Do you see that?
Yes.
2 seconds. Yes, I will.
Okay. Line 579. Conjugium could be by itself. Domum patris could be a phrase by itself and in natus. If the accusative is correct, then it is a stand-in for parentes, fathers for parents or ancestors, making 4 elements. Austin rejects the accusative on the grounds that, while a frequent synonym for parentes in inscriptions, there is no clear evidence in literary Latin for such usage. He says, we've never seen an example where patres is a stand-in for parentes. Furthermore, he sees a parallel for the reading of 3 elements, and I think this is what Sam was talking with me about between the periods yesterday. He said, well, does Virgil have a tendency to group things in 3s? If he does, then this is probably patris, the genitive, making 3 elements. And indeed, as Austin observes here, he sees a parallel for the reading of 3 elements in Book 2, lines 137 to 138, in which Sinon, remember Sinon, the lying Greek who had kind of been planted there on the shore of Troy to trick them into giving this Trojan horse, yearns for patriam, natos, and parente. As has already been discussed, arguments against unique usage avail little. Just because there's no other attested use of it, so freaking what, all right? At least I think, and some others think as well. Gould disagrees with Austin and accepts the accusative reading, since the rhythm of the line, 2 sets of 2 elements with a conjunction in each set, has Virgilian parallels. Murgia agrees with Gould, adding that the 4 specific elements of father, wife, home, and child that come to Aeneas's mind in 559 to 563 are paralleled here. He also notes the accusative reading may be an example of using the plural for the singular. Often happens in other languages. Skip to the next paragraph there. Horsfall agrees with Murgia. He finds support within the Aeneid itself, pointing to 1.190 or 1.95 ante ora patrum, where it is clear the word has a broader meaning. Now, I definitely agree with that. Okay, this notion that patres can't mean parentes, that's nuts, because it clearly does in Book 1, line 95, where Aeneas says, how blessed were the folks who got to die before the faces of their fathers. Now, surely that didn't mean just literally their male parents. That's not what we were talking about. It had to be, and so I would certainly agree with Horsfall and Murgia in that regard. Now we're going to skip this next part. Honestly, it's more of the same regarding this line, habet haec Victoria in 584. It gets a little bit murky, and I'm willing to skip that and move on. So we've talked about the syntactical kind of stuff. Skip down to the bottom of page 15. From the lexical and syntactical perspectives, we turn next to stylistic analysis. The distinctiveness of Virgilian, do you see where we are?
I said a lot of Y's. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I misunderstood. The distinctiveness of Virgilian style provides a litmus test that some have applied to the HE in an attempt to determine authorship. Okay? You do know how certain authors write. You do know how they speak. You know their voice as an author. And because Virgil's style is pretty distinct, and people study this and looked at this, and we say, okay, let's look at this stylistically now. Fairclough, for example, finds the passage perfectly Virgilian and would not question it. were it not for the fact that none of the earliest manuscripts contained these elements. So that does seem a little bit suspicious, but otherwise it seems fairly nice and Virgilian. For illustration, he points out the parallel between the HE and its following lines and the opening of the Odyssey, Book 20, in which Odysseus considers killing the maids who had consorted with the suitors, only to be stopped by Athena. I don't know if you remember that passage or not, but here's a hero who considers killing women and gets stopped by a goddess. Here's Aeneas, who considers killing a woman and gets stopped by a goddess. There's a pretty clear parallel there. Fairclough draws attention to the fact that both heroes meditate the slaying of women, both soliloquize, both fail to carry out their murderous intent, and both are reminded of three things by a deity. From this he concludes, the parallel is fairly complete, and the conclusion seems irresistible, that as this Homeric scene must have been in the mind of him who composed the Helen episode, the whole of the passage involved, the doubtful and undoubted lines alike, must be the work of one and the same poet, which is to say, Virgil himself. So Fairclough clearly says, yeah, this is Virgil. Okay? Now, Austin applies the same test of style to one of the disputed phrases above, sceleratus pointus. As noted, he sees this as an example of transferred epithet and concludes that this particular expression is a Virgilian invention and not the work of a lesser poet. Now, here's where we get into something kind of interesting. He is, however, bothered by the excessively repetitious vocabulary of these lines. Consider, you've got forms of sedes, sedio, aspicio, pharaoh, and you can see through all those examples. The same words appear multiple times in a very short, in this 20-line passage. And that's a little suspicious, to have that much repetition of words. Nevertheless, Austin concludes that there are enough Virgilian touches in word arrangement, alliteration, and assonance to warrant claiming his authorship. Now, here's I really want you to see this as students. In contrast, Gould sees the very repetition of vocabulary pointed out by Austin as evidence that it could not have been Virgil who wrote these lines. So the very evidence that one scholar uses to say, yeah, it probably was Virgil, another scholar takes the same evidence and says, this proves that it wasn't. Okay? So, as we were talking yesterday, there is a lot of subjectivity in this. And as you guys who, if you're doing critical thinking or TOK or stuff, you talk about the difference in the human sciences and the natural sciences and so forth. And one of the standard issues that people have brought up from time to time is that the human sciences, those that primarily deal with us, can't be subjected to the same tools of study as, say, physics and bio and chem. You can't apply those same tools to psych and sociology and economics or philology. And some people say that you can. And I gotta be honest, that's one of the big problems I have so much. I'm sure you are very well aware of what's going on in education across our country and across our state. The notion that everything is testable and that test scores determine things. I'm not saying they're wholly irrelevant, but I don't think that they can be relevant in the same way they are when you're measuring test tubes. There's just too many factors because, well, think about what you do in science. You're able to control for variables. You can't control for every variable that could be affecting a student's performance or could be affecting a particular economic trend. You can't control for every possible variable. So I don't think that you can apply those tools in the same way. So obviously there's some subjectivity here. He further finds it suspicious that the vocabulary of the HE echoes 10 well-known passages of the Aeneid, which he then lists, concluding that if this suggestion could be hardened into proof, non-Virgilian authorship would necessarily be proved also. So he finds that in the HE, there's lots of examples, and he can find them in all other parts of the Aeneid. Well, as I go on to say, since Gould admits, however, that this is not proof, and indeed it could instead be used to prove consistency of theme, this argument can reasonably be dismissed. At the end of the day, that doesn't mean anything. All this business about the similarity of vocabulary can be used to show that it was Virgil, can be used that it wasn't Virgil, and at that point I say, throw it out. That's a useless line to pursue because it could go either way. Horsfall, on the other hand, finds the argument persuasive. To him, this lack of invention and innovation suggests a brilliantly meticulous warming over of ingredients, whose familiarity emerges more and more clearly from close study. The result seems ponderously, excessively Virgilian. Once again, this proves nothing regarding authorship. If this passage was merely a typicane, and I'll explain that, it is not unreasonable to think that Virgil leaned on the tried and true as a sketch of what the passage could become. All right, the word typicane means a prop. All right, typicane is a prop. Something you would use to hold something else up. So maybe you can imagine a ship on the beach and you're going to do some work on the ship, right? Because you need to prop the ship up. You just ram any old piece of wood up under it just to hold it up there while you work on the ship. That's typicane. And Virgil has these props in different places throughout the Aeneid, most notably these half lines. We know it wasn't finished. We know that he kind of propped up the story here and there just with a little bit so he could go on with his narrative, and he never got back to polish this off. Okay. One theory is that the HE itself, the whole passage itself, is one of these props. And that maybe Virgil did write it, but he wanted it removed. He didn't like it, and he wanted it removed, and that's why Varius took it and did remove it. Okay. But my point is, okay, even though if it's, let's say it's a prop, if it's a prop as an author, I know what I'd do. If I wasn't sure what to put in a particular spot, I would go with something I was very familiar with, something I knew how to do and to write well. And so if he says there's all these other parallels throughout the Aeneid, well, that makes perfect sense to me. Because let's say it wasn't finished, but he says, well, I'm going to use it as a prop here. He's going to go with something familiar to him with lots of these common words and so forth. No big surprise there. In addition to his favorable view of Gould's argument, Horsfall also advances his own interpretation of this lexical repetitiveness. He says, these lines are tremendous stuff, but at the same time rather breathless and claustrophobic. Lexical and thematic repetition is used immoderately, and there is little trace here of the restraint and economy of Virgil at his majestic best. Now, okay, that's a fair point, all right? Virgil, here's the deal. I don't care if it's musician, writer, artist, whatever, you gotta know when to back off. And nowhere is that better displayed musically than in blues music. There will be the riff, and then there's the silence, and it creates this tension, and you want that next part, and then comes the next riff, and then there's this silence again. You gotta know how to put that silence in there to make it effective. And he says this is just over the top. There's alliteration all over the place. There's repetition of words all over the place. It's too much. Virgil would have pulled back on this stuff a little bit. This is not him at his majestic best. As I go on to say, this could be a persuasive argument, were it not for Horsfall's own refutation of it. Horsfall had earlier said, quote, Virgil had not yet mastered the complexities of simultaneous narrative when he wrote Aeneid II. He would learn from reading the historians. By his, meaning Horsfall's own account, this book is not Virgil's majestic best. He's already said that he doesn't think this is the best stuff, and if that's the case, then why fault the HE for what is not majestically and optimally Virgilian? That seems a little unfair. Amergius sees the repetitiveness of the vocabulary as excessive, but interprets it as hyper-Virgilian rather than un-Virgilian. The main difference between our poet and Virgil, he says, is not so much genius as taste. He's been able to imitate anomalies of Virgilian style, but has been unable to duplicate Virgilian restraint. The result is a super-Virgil. This, of course, is persuasive only if we're already convinced that Virgil did not write the passage. The lack of restraint may simply have been a feature that would have caused Virgil to mark it for deletion. Again, we keep coming back to, did Servius lie when he said that Varius cut it out? And ultimately, a lot of these guys go off assuming that Servius was lying about that, and then basically go back and trying to prove it. I'm going, but what if he told the truth? What if these guys did cut it out? Maybe Virgil did think it was a crap passage. It still doesn't mean he didn't write it. He may have written it, but had made a side note, says, by God, if I ever die, cut this out. I mean, that's not unrealistic. Now, I'm going to skip this next part. It's more of the same kind of thing about style. I think we can reasonably pass that up. But I am going to bring this up to you. Cicero, great example of literary imitators. Cicero was known for really putting in a little bit of poetry into his speeches. We didn't really talk about this at all when we did Cicero last year. But a number of his end sections end with something like this. Esse videatur, okay? Some essay and some present passive subjunctive of a second conjugation verb. Let it seem to be whatever, okay? Now there's endless varieties. You can put any other second conjugation verb in here, but you still get this rhythm, esse videatur, bum, 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 bum. And because he did that so much, people who wanted to sound like Cicero would include that rhythm in Latin at the ends of sections of their speeches, okay? But just putting that at the end of your speech does not Cicero make, okay? Just because you throw that line in, the rest of your speech could really be pretty crappy, okay? And that really doesn't mean you suddenly become, ooh, I'm Cicero because I did esse videatur at the end, okay? So some of these guys are saying, you know what, there's an imitator here who imitated some of Virgil's stuff, but really just kind of went too far with it. So that's what they're saying, all right? All right, top of page 19, I want to pick up with the last sentence of the first full paragraph, okay? This author Murgia finds fault with the description of the triumph itself. Right? He imagined, go back to the HE, and he imagines, Aeneas does, in line 580, right? He says, is she going to get to go see her home? Is she going to get to see her father, her kids, this stuff? And he says in 580, Iliadum turba et frigiis comitata ministris. Okay? Is she going to go along? Well, actually picks it up in 578. Partoque ibit regina triumpho. Is she going to go along as a queen in some sort of a triumph? Is she going to get to see her father, her home, her husband? Accompanied by turba iliadum, a crowd of Trojan women and Phrygian attendants. Okay? Murgia finds fault with the description of the triumph here, arguing that while a turba is often seen accompanying a triumph, it is with reference to the soldiers of the victor. Murgia's problem is a triumph, an actual Roman triumph, has very specific parts to it. And yeah, there may be a turba, all right, so the general's walking through the streets of Rome, he's got a turba, but the turba is made up of captured enemy soldiers. This turba's a crowd, right? So he's got a crowd of captured enemy soldiers. And he says, that's not what Virgil writes here. And he doesn't say that. As I say, this, however, is to read too much into the HE. Line 578 merely says, Partoquibit regina triumpho. She goes along as the queen in a triumph. It does not say that Helen will lead the triumph. This would have fallen to her kingly husband. Reference conjugium, right in that same passage, 579. She's simply going along in it. Although it is a triumph for which she is responsible. The fact that Greeks have conquered Troy she is ultimately responsible in a way. As for turba, consider line 580, Iliadum turba et frigiis comitata ministries. Now compare this with Aeneid 1.497, in which Dido processes magna unum stipante caterva. This is when they're getting ready to go out for the hunt. And here comes Queen Dido. And she comes out, right? And she is surrounded by a magna caterva, right? It's this big crowd of young people. There is no reason to suppose Helen's turba as anything other than the human spoils of war pressed into service as her attendants. Indeed, he uses the word ministries. Murgia himself acknowledges this impossible interpretation in footnote 35, but claims comitata is the wrong word to use here. All in all, this is placing far too much weight on a literal interpretation of the triumph. Comitata is the perfect word since the captives are ministry. Now this one I think is going to blow your mind for sheer raw nerdiness. We come at last to a metrical discussion of the HE. A discussion that is focused almost entirely on a perceived excessive incidence of elision at the penthemimeral caesura. I just want you to have the pleasure of life of saying that phrase with me. Say it with me, pentamineral caesura.
Pentamineral caesura.
I want to tell you something, folks, that's worth the price of the class right there. The fact that you got to say pentamineral caesura. That is, well, I tell you what, my guy, you sound highfalutin when you say that. And if you follow pentamineral caesura up with passive paraphrastic, well, I tell you what, people will just be falling at your feet. They're going to think you're gods among men. Yes, we're going to tell you. All right, so an elision. We know what an elision is, right?
Yeah.
An elision's a
That's like when you say words together.
slur the words together, right? Word ends with a vowel. Next word begins with a vowel, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
you do that.
Now, go back and look at, I want to look at, go look at, there's a wonderful phrase. Look at 572. Yeah, look at 572. Well, no, it's don't look at 572. It's well, okay, you can. No, that's fine. Look at the word donium et. Now, somebody explain why that would be an elision. Donium et. There you go. First word ends with vowel M, and the next word begins with a vowel. There would be an elision there. Pentamineral means at the fifth half foot. So, right, each foot can be broken into two. So at the fifth half foot in the line, if there's an elision there, people have done some study. They've noticed that there tends to be, a lot of Latin authors will tend to have an elision right at that spot, at the fifth half foot of the line, or the pentamineral caesura. Okay? What we call the pentamineral caesura. Okay. Some people think there's too many elisions at the pentamineral caesura within this 20-line passage of the HE. Among English language scholars, Shipley has given this the most careful analysis. After acknowledging that he had formerly agreed with German scholars Thilo, Leo, Heinze, and Norton, that the HE was an interpolation largely on the grounds of excessive elision at the caesura, he concludes the opposite, but for the same reason. Now this, again, before you get into this, you must realize, right, this is not CGI, these are real actors here, okay? This is not done with hitting Control F, this is not done with any computer aid. These guys sat down page after page and had a pad of paper and a pen and counted stuff up. He begins by noting that there are 285 examples of elision with the word et at the pentamineral caesura. Can you imagine how long it would have taken to go through the Aeneid and count up how many times the word et appeared in the middle of the line and elision occurred with it? Apparently there are 285 of them. Now, this occurs, get this, this occurs once every 33 lines. So if you put it out across the ratio across the whole Aeneid, you get this kind of elision once every 33 lines. Given this ratio for the entire poem, an occurrence of 3 in 22, or a ratio of 1 in 7 for the HE, seems disproportionately high. Now when you put it like that, you see it, right? If this kind of elision only occurs once every 33 lines, but within this 20-line passage it occurs at a rate of once every 7 lines, that is way more frequent than the pattern of the poem as a whole, and might be a clue to non-Virgilian authorship. He observes, however, now this is the key piece that he's observed, that examples of such elision tend to occur in groups, and that the question must be whether there are multiple examples of this type of elision in close proximity. Throughout the entire Aeneid, you tend to have little groups of this elision, and then little groups of this elision, then little groups of this elision. And yeah, spread out, it comes out to 1 in 33. But in actual fact, they do tend to be in little groups of closer proximity. Now he draws our attention to 3 instances of elision with et at the pentamineral caesura in book 3, line 188 to 122, or 222, and 3 more in book 12. Although one of the examples in this latter group involves ut, it falls within the parameters of the discussion. Ut, et, same thing. Given the ratios of the phenomenon in these groups, Shipley concludes that the apparently excessive caesural elision in the HE is not unique. He's got other chunks of around 20 lines where the ratio is similarly high. Furthermore, Shipley notes, now this is really impressive to me, Shipley notes that in the 400 lines of which the HE is the center, so if you went out, you know, a couple hundred lines on either side, and the 20 lines of the HE are smack in the center, there are similarly high ratios for this kind of elision. It occurs at a rate of 1 in 4 for lines 401 to 412, 1 in 5 for lines 475 to 495, and 1 in 8 for lines 749 to 780. Much closer to the ratio of the HE. Now, even if we omit the HE, the ratio for this kind of elision in the second half of book 2 is 1 in 25, a ratio higher than any other book. So even if you do cut out the HE, there's still something about book 2. He seems to have done this a lot for some reason in book 2. Says Shipley, the Helen passage conforms in this particular feature to the technique of the 400 lines of which it is the center. If it was written by an interpolator, you know, a fake, he was familiar with details of technique which have for the most part escaped the notice of most modern scholars. So some ancient guy faked Virgil. He was an amazing fake because he has managed to get his elisions in about the same proportion as the elisions of all the other lines around it. This leads him to conclude, as a result, I am satisfied that the apparent metrical peculiarities not only do not prove un-Virgilian authorship, but on the contrary, are strong evidence in favor of the hypothesis that the passage was originally drafted by Virgil in its present form, but was omitted by Varius and Tuca in accordance with the poet's known wishes on the matter. Austin agrees with Shipley. Horsfall, like Shipley, notes it. Now, Gould and Murgia, top of 21, on the other hand, find the excessive elision evidence of an imitator working too hard to capture a known feature of an author. Again, kind of like Esse Videator with Caesar, or with Cicero. Murgia writes, in seeking to produce a Virgilian passage, the poet has gone too far. I'm sorry, I gotta say, I do think this is pretty compelling stuff to me. I don't see how someone would have reasonably duplicated that. Despite these varied approaches to analysis, we are perhaps no closer, 21 pages in, to solving the difficulties surrounding the HE. In the last century alone, we find that Fairclough and Shipley conclude for Virgilian authorship and take the Servian account of its deletion as correct. Austin also accepts the HE as Virgilian and denies that it was removed for the reasons Servius claimed. Gould, Murgia, Renahan, and Horsfall all reject Virgilian authorship. So it's basically who you want to believe. As for the broader audience of the Iliad, it is safe to say that the HE has passed into popular acceptance. Most, if not all, English translations, beginning with Gavin Douglas in 1513, including even the execrable rendering by Stanihurst. Remember that one that we bashed so hard? I just wanted to have a chance to bash it in print. And continuing through the most recent by Frederick Aall to 2007. Who of you likes the Aall translation? Is that you? These all preserve it. Only two, Fagles and Aall, indicate challenges to its authenticity in their notes. In art, we see the scene depicted as well. So we see it in pretty much every English translation. We see it in graphic art. The scene has been interpreted. It has just passed into the common acceptance of what the Iliad is. It is no surprise that a supporter of authenticity like Fairclough would say that the passage should be included in additions of Book 2. Murgia would be happy to keep it if it could be conclusively shown to be Virgilian. Even Renahan, who believes with Murgia and others that these lines are not Virgilian, notes that they have been printed in the text of Virgil for centuries and will continue to be so printed. This is as it should be, he says, provided that their spurious character be signalized by conventional square brackets, as long as we indicate that something's fishy. After careful study of the relevant literature, I'm inclined to say that the lines are Virgilian and that they were removed by Varius and Tuca, as Servius said. We extend to Servius the same consideration that we would to a criminal on trial, namely that the onus probandi, or the burden of proof, lies with the prosecution. We cannot conclude otherwise. None of the arguments advanced thus far sufficiently proves a lack of authenticity for these lines. In conclusion, I would offer a few words as to how the HE can be a profitable study for high school students. One of the key elements in the International Baccalaureate Diploma program is the Theory of Knowledge course. It guides students to see the challenges that arise from how we know what we know in various areas and to seek the strongest possible ways of knowing. Whether or not a school offers the IB diploma, or even AP Latin for that matter, students can, through a look at the narrative, lexical, syntactical, stylistic, and metrical analyses of the Helen episode, gain an understanding of the tools that philologists use to establish a text. They can begin to see that the Aeneid does not exist in a pristine autograph from Virgil, but that the version in their textbook is the result of years, centuries even, of professional study. It may be argued that there is a little time for such discussion, especially in an IB or AP classroom. Indeed, Gould acknowledges this. And before I read the quote, because I love the quote, when he says a Nelson eye, that's a British expression that means a blind eye, turning a blind eye. He says, an elementary teacher, to reach in due season the end of his curriculum, must every hour turn a Nelson eye to serious problems and refrain from pursuing truth beyond the charted boundaries of the textbook. I would argue that the true magister can never be so bound, but must, along with the students, pursue the truth, no matter how unfractious the path. I've got one more instance of unfractious in there. I absolutely love that quote because I so profoundly disagree with it. And when he says elementary, he doesn't mean like grade school. He simply means the below collegiate level. We've got lots of curriculum to cover. Your bio teacher, your English teacher, your history teacher, your Latin teacher, we've all got curriculum that has to be covered. But man, if that's all you're doing is racing to get through the curriculum by December or to get through the curriculum by May. You saw Dead Poets Society. We watched Dead Poets Society as Latin Club when they were going out there reading poetry, and the kind of rebel kid, Charlie, brought the girls out there, and some of the other kids were like, hey, you know, we're not supposed to bring girls out here, you know. And Charlie brings up a good point. He says, if all we're doing is sitting around here reading poetry, then what the hell are we doing? If this isn't about wooing girls, then guys, I'm out of here, right? I mean, this is a waste of time. And if all we're doing is racing through to get through the curriculum, let's read these lines, let's work these problems, let's read the next chapter, let's get through the curriculum, then what the hell are you doing? That's a stunning waste of your time. You've got to be willing to go past the charted boundaries of the textbook and not turn a blind eye to serious problems of knowledge and be willing to explore this. Now, that doesn't mean that you can totally wreck the class and say, okay, you know, we're just going to go do a whole other thing. But for us, we had some time built into this, the 9 weeks here, and I'm going to probably build this piece in now in the future because I think it's worth exploring. Got a little bit of time for some comments here. I want to talk two things. I want to talk, what do you think about the passage itself, the Helen episode? Yay, nay, you like it or not? Is it Virgilian? Is it not? And I want to talk about what you think of how these scholars have approached it. So I don't care which question you want to deal with, but talk about something. Coop.
Alright, well, usually really hate conversations like this because, like, especially stuff like this that you can't change the fact that nobody really knows and you can't, but I like the way that you went about it. You, in particular, you refuted every argument that you could find, and you concluded, based on the rules that you knew, that it was Virgilian, and I'm inclined to agree with you. I really like the argument you made.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, Christian.
What was that awesome word?
Penthemimeral Caesar.
Penthemimeral
Was that awesome?
And okay, first off that, and like at first I was like, oh, it's excessive. So like, yeah, this guy's just an imitator, and he's
Right.
just kind of exaggerating it. But then that whole thing about in certain lines it was like 4 times or whatever.
Yeah.
And then it would go to 8.
Yeah.
I was like, oh. Yeah.
Did you find that compelling?
Yeah, I was like, it's definitely Virgilian.
I gotta say, I probably of all the different stuff that was thrown out there, to me that was probably the most compelling argument on any side.
One of the guys said, like, it was 1 and 7, that's too excessive, right? In some
You
other
get
parts, there was,
1,
there was
5.
more frequent than that.
That's right, you
And
down to
we say
1
nothing
4.
about those.
And yet you say nothing of those.
Yeah,
Exactly right.
I think the argument that it's too Virgilian and therefore it's an imitator.
It's
Sometimes it
absurd.
just was like.
It's too Virgilian.
It's too good, they couldn't possibly have done
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
You know
How
what I'm
many
saying?
times can you use
It's
that?
too close to how he
Like,
wrote
so
it.
many times it's
Possibly.
too Virgilian. I'm like, well, how many times can you actually say it's too Virgilian and get away with it?
I think
You're
too-
stop saying that.
too-
Like,
Yeah.
I get it's like that's your top little argument, but then they're just like, like whatever someone would say was like, well, that's just proving that it's too Virgilian. Like, no, you can't just say
Yeah.
that it is Virgilian.
I think
Yeah.
with the arguments that against or that it was Virgilian, it seemed like they purposefully sort of overlooked things more than like people who argued against or argued for it being Virgilian. It seemed like people argued for it, like look at all these things,
Mhm.
and then they're kind of Danielle over there. Like the other side was kind of just like, well, that just proves our point because like yeah, it's excessive. It's like how's that? What about like this random passage here? That's Virgilian. Like, they don't question that. But
Well,
what
and
about
I
this
do
passage?
think those of you who are doing TOK, I think you bring this to bear, not this particular passage of the Latin, but bring this issue to bear in some of your conversation. How do you prove something? You know, now some of these guys have attempted to prove something by analyzing this or counting that, and other guys have tended to seemingly to prove stuff by yelling. I'm not sure, you know, and maybe yelling does prove something. Yeah.
I mean, there's some, like, the arguments, like, you can give to, like, the repetitive words, and I think that he uses, like, the same words throughout, different times, and, the whole vision thing's used repetitively, but that could be, I mean, it also just says why did he want it cut, if he wanted it cut, like, he just might not have wanted that there, like, for the same reasons that it might be too Virgilian, he said this is too much for right here.
He may well have. And again, if it was not a for real finished piece, maybe he'd say, yeah, you know what, guys, be sure you scrap this. That's possible. Question, could you ever see yourself doing any of this kind of work? And I don't mean to say it in such a way to expect a no answer, but could you ever see yourself doing any of the kind of work that these guys have done?
Maybe not for like specifically for Virgil, but like if it was some sort of like
You're like,
probably historical like topic that was really interesting, like yeah,
Okay.
maybe,
I
but
know.
I'd have to be really
I have to
interested.
be really interested in it.
Yeah.
Okay, we certainly had to be interested in it.
But if I had like interest